Good evening, everyone. Hi. All right, we're going to get started. Everyone's in their seats. That's great. So apologies, we're a little bit behind schedule, but there was so many of you, and we had to get the room ready to go. So I would like to begin this evening by inviting Lillian Howard to come to the stage to provide us with a welcome. Lillian is a member of the Muchalit First Nations and of Nuchalnuth and Kwakwaka'wakw ancestry. She's also on the City of Vancouver's Urban Indigenous Peoples Advisory Committee. Please join me in welcoming Lillian.
Good evening, everyone. Uklashis Nanahamis. He's actually it's Moachat. So yes, she's Nuchalnuth, Kwakwaka'wakw, Tlingit. My English name is Lillian Howard, and I'm from the First Nation of the Muchalit, and also of Nuchalnuth, Tlingit, and Kwakwaka'wakw ancestry, which is really, really important to me. That's where my extended family comes from. Tlako, Amasis, Musqueam, Tsleil-Waututh, Squamish, Tlako, Nas, Hupi'i, Ushims'i, Hupi'i, Mumtliaksup, Hineapatli, Klimaxti, Hineapatli, Ophinis. I come from a place of colonial oppression, and that has been going on for 200 years. And it's really, really important for people who are coming from all over the world to live in the homelands of the Squamish, Tsleil-Waututh, Musqueam, Nuchalnuth, Kwakwaka'wakw, Tlingit, and all the other First Nations in British Columbia. The most important message that we can ask is that you respect your visitors in their homelands, and that you respect the Indigenous peoples of these many, many homelands and territories of Indigenous peoples in British Columbia and Canada. You respect the people, you respect the land, you respect the culture, and really work at understanding why Indigenous people are in the situation we're in today. Colonial oppression, high suicide rates, so many social issues that we face on a daily basis. And one thing I do respect about Vancouver is that it has become, or is in the process of becoming, a city of reconciliation. Not just for Indigenous peoples, but for the homeless, for the women, for the two-spirited people, for people who face racism. The sad reality in Canada is that it's a very racist country. Very racist country. Visibly, I face it every day, but it's also institutional. And you as settlers have the privilege to change it, to make it a better world for your children and our children. And that's all we ask. It's all we ask. We have such a huge responsibility as Indigenous peoples. in BC and in Canada and in other Indigenous worlds. And only you and I can change that. We can't depend on corporations or oppressive governments. We all have an opportunity to make good, positive change in protecting what we know now as Mother Earth. The other sad factor is violence against Indigenous women. I'm an advocate, an activist. There is so much violence against Indigenous women. I've experienced it as a rape victim twice, being physically abused, being shunned from society. And that's also what's happening to Mother Earth. Mother Earth is being raped and pillaged. So we really do have a huge responsibility in appreciating each other as human beings. We all have a place. We all have a rightful place on Mother Earth. So men, women, children have a huge responsibility. And the thing is, there is so much joy that we can find in Mother Earth. We need to begin celebrating Mother Earth. We need to celebrate women, children. And as men and women, we need to work together and to live that quality of life that Canada can offer. It's not surprising that people from all over the world come to Canada. In Indigenous communities, we have the totem poles with the hands uplifting like this, welcoming people from all over the world. And all we ask is that you respect the people, you respect the land, you respect the culture, and appreciate each other, the diversity that we have in Canada, in Vancouver especially. We need to celebrate more. We need to appreciate more. And celebrate our existence. And I'm going to close it with that. Cheers, let go, let go.
So thank you, Lillian, for starting us off in such a good way with really important words for us to be thinking about as we move into this lecture. So again, thank you all for being here on this gorgeous evening. I'm Janet Weber. I'm the executive director of a program here at SFU called SFU Public Square. We're a community engagement initiative, and basically that means that we collaborate and we convene to bring people together in places like this to learn from and with each other to work towards solving some of our pressing issues, which Lillian has brought great attention to tonight. We're thrilled to be co-presenting the BMO public lecture tonight with the Department of Economics, and thrilled to welcome Dr. Nava Ashraf. We're proud to say this is the 6th time that we have done this event, and we're very excited to be part of this evening. And so are all of you, considering how quickly this event sold out, which was like hotcakes. It was like a rock show, really. It's quite impressive. And we're also, our team is really excited to be here because we do a community summit every year, and this year our community summit, which will be in April 2020, is on inequality. So Lillian's words, and some of the words that I think you're going to talk about tonight, it's super interesting for us to think about how behavioral economics can help us make better decisions, create better policies, and organizations to improve social welfare. I hope you all enjoy tonight's presentation. I'd like to pass it over to the MC for the evening, Dr. Jasmina Ervovic, I'm working on this, newly appointed Associate Chair of SFU's Department of Economics.
Thank you, Janet. Good evening, everybody. I'd like to welcome you again to this event that's been jointly organized with SFU Department of Economics, SFU Public Square, and SFU Alumni Association. I would also like to thank the BD School for helping host this event and also providing us with a space. And then we also want to gratefully acknowledge the financial support provided by BMO, Bank of Montreal, for allowing us to bring in top economists from around the world in this annual event that's been hosted here at the Public Square. So before I introduce the speaker, I would just like to mention a couple of things. After the lecture, we are going to have a moderated Q&A session, and in this session, there will be mic runners, so you'll raise your hands and they will come with you, to you with their mics. Please try to make sure that your questions are short and concise so that we give everybody a turn. There is a photographer here at site tonight, so if there's anybody who doesn't want their picture to be taken, please let us know, let one of the staff members know about it. So let me just briefly try to introduce our tonight's speaker, Nava Ashraf. It would take a lot of time to try to go over all of her great accomplishments, so I will try to leave more room and time for her to present her work. Let me just say that she's a professor at the Department of Economics at LSE. She's also a research director at Marshall Institute. She has got her PhD at Harvard University, and then prior to going to LSE, she was assistant and associate professor there between 2005 and 2016. She's a lead academic for Zambia at the International Growth Center, a fellow at BRED and a fellow at NBER, as well as affiliated professor at the MIT Jameel Poverty Action Lab. So, Professor Ashraf's work sort of combines economics and psychology and applies concepts from behavioral economics in trying to apply and study the effects of economic policies on global development in Africa, South America, Southeast Asia. One of her great contributions to the field has been she pioneered the concept of altruistic capital, a way to harness every individual's intrinsic desire to sort of help contribute to the public good, to have positive social impact. She's published in top economics journals, and she has also she was awarded a Queen's Jubilee Medal for service by the Government of Canada, and she's the youngest person ever to receive the Order of BC. Last but not least, Nava is actually our British Columbian, and I'm sure we are very happy to have her here tonight give us a lecture. So I would like to thank her for coming out here after all the problems with the travels that she had. And I would also like to thank David Jacks, who was the associate chair until 2-3 days ago, for actually organizing the whole event. And I'm here just taking over for him. Thank you, David. Nava, can you please come to the stage?
Thank you so much, Jasmine. Thank you, David. Thank you, everyone, for this incredibly warm welcome and all of the exaggerated, beautiful things you said. I'm just glad that my mom is here to listen. That's all. It's such a pleasure to be back in British Columbia and to have had such a beautiful orientation by Lillian. I want to talk tonight about the assumptions we make about human nature that are implicit in our models, and that often we don't really take time to reflect on, but that actually drive the institutions we develop, the incentives we design, the products we offer in the marketplace. And the way in which the evidence in particular, I'm going to be talking about in economic science, has evolved to make us question these assumptions and to potentially come up with other assumptions about human nature. And to really start to imagine together a future in which we are able to bring out the best parts of our human nature, the ones that Lillian oriented us towards. So maybe just to start, I think if you remember, any of you remember back to your Econ 101 classes, you know, the standard, really like kind of almost straw man idea of Homo economicus, the basic assumptions that we have in economic models, are that we are mainly driven by self-interest in economic behavior. That's just been a simplifying assumption. It's been easy to make, but it's not innocuous. And also that we, you know, the self-interest that drives us, we're pretty good at maximizing it. We know how to rationally make sure that it gets done. And indeed, in that process, we're never conflicted. That means everything we do is what deep down we really wanted to do. So there's no regrets, no problems with self-control, no temptation. And this kind of perfect model of rationality is the one that we often teach to our students, to the point in which they start to try to design for this kind of person. But of course, we're not that way. And we're often puzzles not only to others, but also to ourselves. You know, we do all kinds of things that don't always make sense. And we're, you know, affected by the context around us, even despite our best intentions to get to exercise a little bit. If the escalator's there, we'll probably take it. Behavioral economics, which is sort of a field within economics that started as a rebel faction and now is kind of becoming more mainstream, has gotten to bring more realistic assumptions about human nature, that we are imperfect and we need all the help we can get. And in particular, we have strong present bias and limited attention, and these imperfections can be amplified by stress and uncertainty. And that far from self-interest driving the majority of our decisions, in fact, we care a lot about others in economically significant ways. But that crucially, how we design our environment determines the choices we make. And this is this area of choice architecture, of becoming designers of the environment, of recognizing that any environment we're in is actually being designed for us to go in one direction or another, to privilege one side or another. And if we're not conscious of it, then we will go towards whatever direction that the environment is designing us towards. But that we could consciously design environments to bring out the best in us, to bring out different parts of us. And in particular, tonight, I'm going to talk about two areas of application here. One is how we orient towards the future, towards kind of our long-term best interest. And the other is how we orient towards others, towards our kind of potentially inherent altruism. In talking about this, I want to go a little bit beyond where we've been at in behavioral economics. As many of you probably know, we have a lot of nudge units. Even in BC, we have a new nudge unit. But to think about going to not only realize that we respond to our environment, but that actually not only can we transform our environment, but we can create environments that begin to transform us. So let's start with our orientation towards the future. This is an early experiment that was done. And imagine in the reception right now, I'm going to ask you, we're going to go out there and you're going to get to choose between fruit and chocolate that's out there. If you were deciding today, would you choose fruit or chocolate for next week? Imagine you were going to come back for another lecture, and today you were going to get it next week. How many fruit? How many chocolate? Yeah. So when this is done traditionally, typically subjects choose, actually very similar to here, 74% choose fruit. Okay, but now I'm going to say, like, right now, it's going to be outside. If you were choosing today, would you choose fruit or chocolate for today? Fruit? Chocolate? Yeah. So very similar. So 74% choose chocolate if it's going to be today. And so this is what we call time and consistent preferences. Because it's for the same time, but as soon as it's right now, suddenly a different part of you is in control. And this is a pretty hardwired part of us, right? Evolutionarily, we have to focus on what's there right now. You can see it in children. I highly recommend Googling the marshmallow experiment and watching the kids try to avoid the temptation of waiting for the next marshmallow. And this is a really important quality of delay of gratification. And it has a lot of roots in the way our brain evolved. Because, we have these many parts of our brain, but in particular, one way to think about this is that we have, the mammalian brain, which was we have the very, very early brain, which is the reptilian fight or flight brain. And then we have the mammalian, which was developed a little bit later, which is much more involved in emotions and decisions now. And then we have the very, very relatively recent neocortex, which is the one that makes calculations and thinks about the future and thinks rationally. The problem is, even Plato talked about this conflict that we have within us. We have reasons and we have passions, but he had talked about them as two horses. And in fact, it's not really two horses. It's not really a fair fight. It's more like an elephant, a really big elephant that is moving really like in a very intense way, and then a very small rider on top. And the rider is the more recent brain. It takes a long while for it to do anything. Everything else is sort of automatic. And so the question is, what do you do in a circumstance like that, when that's how your brain has evolved? And one way is to basically, that rider is very small. To try to put them in charge and have the willpower is quite difficult. Instead, you can try to nudge the elephant towards the right thing, towards the thing you want. And there's lots of ways that behavioral economics has shown we can do this. So you can shape the path of the elephant for easy progress. So that's things like providing defaults for people to make it just easy for them to do the thing, to giving reminders, for example. You can motivate the elephant as a whole by present rewards and tapping to emotion. Or you can find a way to give more control to the rider, to the little rider on top, which is commitment devices. And that's, of course, what you might remember in your old tale of Odysseus, what Odysseus tried to do. He was very worried about the temptation of the sirens. And so, these sirens would sing a beautiful song, and then all of the men of any ships would always just fall over and be taken up by the sirens. So he put wax in his men's ears, but he asked his men to bind him to the mast of the boat, so that no matter how tempted he was by the siren's song, he would not jump over. And he asked them, "But you must bind me hard and fast so that I cannot stir from the spot where you stand me. And if I beg you to release me, you must tighten and add to my bonds." So this idea of an external commitment, something that just makes the elephant go in that right direction, is something that we probably all use in our lives to some degree. and in fact was something that I saw strongly when I was working in East Africa among many farmers who actually, they would face the temptation of when there was harvest season to spending all the money. And so the way they really wonderful, innovative ways that different farmers found was, for example, one had a lockbox where the neighbor had the key, and another had to planted her sweet potatoes so that they were timed to come due when the school fees were due, so that then they would be used exactly that way. And so we use this insight to try to think about designing innovative products for people in low-income countries who may not face all of the benefits of the institutions we have in developed countries, to be able to help people save more. And we did this in the Philippines in a paper called Tying Odysseus to the Mast, as a throwback to Odysseus, with a microfinance bank. And what we did is actually use the informal products that people were using in their houses. So they were actually using these locked boxes. We designed one with the bank, but this was designed based on what people were using, which was a commitment device with a lock that the bank had the key, and crucially, a contract that you signed with the bank to not let you withdraw the money until a certain date or amount had been reached. So similar to the lady who planted her sweet potato, but creating this as a formal financial product. And what we found is that, in fact, those people who had the same time and consistency that you saw with the fruit and chocolate for today versus next week were exactly the ones who wanted this commitment device and asked for it and took it up. We randomized the offering. And compared to a control group who had access to a regular bank account, after 6 months, they increased their savings by 46%. After 12 months, they increased it by 80%. And that's just on average of the people offered the product compared to the control. This was, at the time, very different from the discourse in microfinance, because the discourse had been really focused on giving out loans. And in fact, the idea that you would, people would voluntarily want to actually tie up their money was quite strange to think about. And we were quite worried about it, but it turned out that it actually had strong welfare implications for the families as well, and increased bargaining power and female empowerment for the women who were offered this product. And since then, commitment devices have been shown to, similar to, in this same way, to stop smoking, to facilitate fertilizer adoption, to get sobriety from alcohol. And you too can sign up for a commitment device if you want, based on this product on stick.com. You can set up your goals, and what you do is you put up some money, and if you don't make your goal, then that money goes to an anti-charity, so the NRA or someone else. Yeah. So that's an example of designing products in the marketplace. So if you think about the products that were offered in the marketplace, right, like credit cards with teaser rates, et cetera, those are products that speak to our present self, right? The immediate gratification part. The idea here is to offer products, to design products and offer products that can help us reach our long-term goals. But of course, to reach your long-term goals, you have to have a really clear idea of what your long-term goals are. In fact, you have to be able to imagine the future. That's not an easy thing. So there's an old, there's a paper from Becker and Mulligan that talks about what is it that makes people be able to, some people be more patient than others, some people be more time consistent. Is there something that actually determines this? And actually, this is a throwback to an Austrian economist from 1891 who says, the present always gets its rise. It forces itself upon us through our senses. To cry for food when hungry occurs even to a baby. But the future, we must anticipate and picture. To properly anticipate and picture the future, to imagine the future, is not straightforward. Why? Because actually, it turns out that the way we imagine the future comes from the same part of our brain that pulls from memory. And so it's the same parts that are active in thinking about the past and thinking about the future. If you've been through any kind of trauma, it can really undermine the capacity to think about the future. This leads to a sense of a foreshortened future, where you keep thinking that something is going to go wrong. and a tendency to remember past events in a non-specific and overgeneral way. And because all of that past has that resonance, it means that thinking about the future is either non-existent because you can't do it or you don't want to, it hurts too much to do it, or it's just very murky. You have no idea what it could possibly offer. Whereas in our models, of course, we think about people having a very precise and clear idea of the future, and then maybe they have a discount factor. But what we're trying to do now in the experiments that we're doing is to go beyond that and to say, what does it really mean to try to imagine the future and to invest and train our ability to imagine a future that's different from our past? And we're doing a new experiment that's in progress right now, actually, as we speak, in Bogota, Colombia, that really posits that this time inconsistency that we see is maybe not a problem of self-control or willpower, but really a difficulty from people being unable to properly, fully visualize their future. And this may be very active for victims of trauma. And we're doing it in Colombia because there are so many victims of trauma from the conflict that arose. That's initially why we started doing it, although many who are involved in our experiment now are actually migrants from Venezuela who face much more recent trauma. So this kind of, the impoverished positive imagery in terms of thinking about the future and overgeneral memory in terms of thinking about the past makes it difficult for people to imagine the future in a constructive way. And the neuroscientist and psychiatrist that we're working with, Emily Holmes, she's done a lot of extraordinary work looking at the way in which people who are depressed have difficulty looking at these realistic images and using the power of emotionally rich images to imagine the future. Because, of course, when you have that emotional resonance in the future, that's part of what motivates you to start acting towards your future. And if you have intrusive memories of the past, that also can impede your actions. So what we're working to do is based on all of her research to create the capacity to stimulate the future accurately through mental imagery. And she's done a lot of this work with people who've gone through trauma. And what we worked with her to do is to design a curriculum for entrepreneurs to think about a future post-conflict. And the idea is to train the capacity to think about the future. So as I mentioned, in Colombia, there's over 8 million victims of conflict. And they have a tremendous amount to offer and contribute. And in fact, it's a country in a great period of reconstruction at the moment where there are actually a lot of material resources available for people who would want to become entrepreneurs and rebuild. But there are these often psychological barriers. And so we're doing this intervention with around 2,000 micro-entrepreneurs, which has a curriculum of entrepreneurship that incorporates this visualization of the future. And I was just there, and it was so inspiring to see people start to imagine themselves in the future, start to imagine their customers, start to imagine how they can contribute through their mind's eye. And in fact, entrepreneurship is something, in order to be innovative, in order to think about entrepreneurship, you actually have to do a lot of imagination, right? And so, so this is something that we want to think about how you can actually train this capacity. And then we're going to compare it to, like all of the work that I'm showing you today is all with field experiments. So there's randomized controlled trials in the field. And we always try to compare them with like with like as much as possible. And so we're going to be comparing with regular entrepreneurship training without this sort of additional visualization. So that's about thinking about the future and about ourselves in the future, our self-interest in the future. What about thinking about others and orienting towards others and our relationship to others? So let's go back to these assumptions. And let's tackle the base one, which is that self-interest drives human behavior. Probably those of you who are, might remember one quote from Adam Smith, probably this one, that it's not from the benevolence of the butcher, the brewer, or the baker that we expect our dinner, but from their regard to their own interest. We address ourselves not to their humanity, but to their self-love, and never talk to them of our own necessities, but of their advantages. So this idea was the idea that, we don't need to rely on people's altruistic motivations to have the market work. We can just rely on their self-interest to provide the needs of the market, and through the benefits of the market, we will get what we need. The thing is that this actually then led to the designing of incentives and work environments that rewarded self-interest and arguably promoted self-interest. The irony is that this is not even what Adam Smith meant. So he started his second book, which he was writing simultaneously with The Wealth of Nations, with the following words: "How selfish soever a man may be, there are some principles in his nature which interest him in the fortune of others and render their happiness necessary to him, though he derives nothing from it except for the pleasure of seeing it. The greatest ruffian, the most hardened violator of society, is not without it." So he's talking about a kind of hardwired natural principle that none of us is without. And actually, over the last 30 years of accumulating evidence in behavioral economics, we've shown sort of the extent to which people are willing to give up their own interest to donate to other people, for example, in experimental games, to show how necessary others' well-being is to us. But the assumption of the self-interest being the main driver of our behavior is still very prominent, because despite the fact that we've had this evidence, many have argued, that's often in a lab setting. It's kind of construed in a particular way. If you put people in the marketplace, they're not going to behave in this way. And so the assumption remains. And we wanted to ask the question in this another experiment that I'm about to tell you, whether you could actually incentivize economic activity through leveraging existing social and altruistic motivation, and to try to think about how you could test it with field data. So I'll talk about one of these early experiments we did in Zambia to try to get at that, and how you can potentially leverage altruistic motivation, which then set us on a journey to think about whether we could, similar to what we were just talking about with the time preference, but in the realm of altruistic motivation, not just nudge people to do a little bit more altruistic action, but potentially to transform, to build altruistic motivation as a capacity to serve others. And so I'll talk about that after this experiment. But first, this experiment. So this was an experiment that we did with a social marketing firm. It was a public health organization in Lusaka, Zambia, who was facing a dilemma. They had this wonderful new technology. At the time, it was a new technology that was the only way that women had to protect themselves against HIV, which was the female condom. And so this is a country where there's a strong prevalence of HIV. And this was a way that women could protect themselves in their own hands. But like many new technologies, it was a difficult technology to learn. And it needed an innovative distribution mechanism, somewhere where people could trust that they could be given good advice, that they could come back to. And so they thought about where is on every street corner around us where people gather and talk about these things and where we could distribute female condoms. And they thought about hairdressers and barbershops, which are a little bit different in Africa, as everyone knows who's been in Africa. They're on every, in our sample, a large proportion in the baseline talked about HIV already in these settings. It was a really great setting for thinking about distributing this new technology. But then the question was, how do we want to treat these hairdressers and barbers? Do we want to think about them as volunteers that are going out and helping people use female condoms? Do we want to treat them as standard retailers and distributors and give them a financial margin? And in fact, there was a motto that the organization had called no margin, no mission, that what we need to learn from the private sector is to give people a financial margin, and then they'll feel a mission towards the thing. Or was there some other form of incentive that we could design that would allow people to feel connected to the work they were doing that wasn't necessarily financial? So that's what we set about to try to do in this field experiment. So we first surveyed all the firms all the salons in Lusaka, which was 2,500 of them, and then we randomized them across the city into 4 different things that correspond to these different models of motivation. So the volunteer, a low financial margin, which gave people a 10% financial margin, high financial margin, which was a 90% financial margin, and non-monetary rewards. So we were trying to design non-monetary rewards so that they were kind of parallel to what you have in financial rewards. So when you create financial incentives, you are basically trying to connect the employee's marginal effort with the marginal profit of the firm, to give them a little bit of the more effort they put in, they have some share of the profit that the firm is also benefiting from. So we try to think about that in the social sphere. And so what we came up with was a thermometer. It was just really symbolic, that every time you sold a female condom, you got a star. And it just went up, and you could see your contribution to community health. Again, very symbolic, just a kind of symbolic connection to this. And then this was randomized across the whole city. And what we found, and then actually we followed them for a year and collected monthly data that was on the inventory stock of the female condoms. And what we found was that the non-financial rewards, the stars, were twice as powerful as even the 90% financial margin in getting the hairdressers and barbers to promote female condoms. There's many mechanisms underneath it. It was a sense of warm glow. It could have been a little bit of social comparison and competition. But a lot of what they said was that they felt connected in some symbolic way to the social impact they were having. Now, interestingly, prior to doing the experiment, we actually had people do an experimental game where they could donate to an HIV charity. So we're able to look at people across what they started with, what the level of altruistic motivation they started with, if they had a kind of below median level of giving and an above median level of giving. And so we can think about how well do people do. So if you're above median level of giving at the beginning, you do a little bit better in selling the female condoms, even in the volunteer condition. But when you put the stars on top, this is the thing. Stars help everyone do better, the low people and the high people. But they help the high people even more. So it's a way of leveraging the existing altruistic motivation across the board, but particularly for people who start out high. Importantly, financial incentives don't crowd out those people. So we often think that money will somehow corrupt or make people feel like it's a dirty activity. In fact, it was far from it. People felt actually valued by what they did, and this crowded in their altruistic motivation. So this led us to be thinking that employees' pro-social motivation can be a source of value for an organization, right? Similar to financial capital, as you could see exactly here. And that, in particular, financial incentives don't necessarily crowd out pro-social motivation, can actually crowd it in. And non-monetary incentives can be designed to leverage this pro-social motivation, similar to effects shown by Adam Grant, for example. And we started thinking in particular about this building of what we call altruistic capital. So if this is a source of value for individuals and then eventually for organizations, it can become an asset. So we started thinking about this concept, and I'll tell you why we call it capital in a second. But we start from the premise that every individual has some latent desire to serve, And it can be from any part of the distribution. So you can think that people have just like we have the people in the low donation and high donation in the hairdresser's experiment, but there can be people who are kind of jerks and people who are angels, and everyone's across the board. The key is that you could, across that, you could provide some kind of incentives. They could be, social incentives like that way we provided, or even potentially financial incentives. And across that, you would encourage people to then start undertaking altruistic action. And so that at every stage, the altruistic motivation can be leveraged by what we call returns to altruistic effort, which depend on the context-specific factors. And the reason we think about it as altruistic capital is that the problem is, actually, if you look at just this is falling into the same trap that we do in our economic models now. So even as we started to incorporate altruism into utility functions in economics as a result of the experimental findings, we still take people as types. We have people who are altruistic types, and we have people who are selfish types, and those are fixed. There are preferences that are given to us, and they are exogenous, and they stay static, at least in our lifetime. There's a few papers that talk about transmission to the next generation. But the question here is that really the case? Or is there a possibility for growth that we have ignored? If we look at much of moral philosophy and virtue ethics and religion, they propose that character actually develops over time through repeated actions. There's an idea that we are what we repeatedly do. And indeed, most recent research on neuroscience similarly suggests that actions beget future actions. That neurons that fire together, wire together. That it is, again, this repeated action that forms habit and then forms character. If that's the case, then altruism isn't necessarily a fixed and exogenously given preference, but it actually could be a capacity, a skill that we learn. And we learn as a result of the environments that we are functioning in. It's an asset that allows us to internalize the effects of our actions on others. We call it capital because, like other forms of capital, and Solow talks about this in his paper, financial capital or human capital, it can be invested in, which means that you can take some actions which are costly in the present, which produce benefits in the future, and it can be accumulated, and it can also be depleted. The important thing is that, and this is really interesting because what it implies is that an organization would need to you would need to basically shift the returns, but then after a while, that would only need to be for a certain period. After a while, it could have its own dynamic. And what this suggests is actually, in a world where you have fixed types and fixed preferences, if you have an industry where there's a lot of those people on the left side of the kind of jerks, you'd have to basically take everyone out and recruit completely new people. If, on the other hand, you could think about accumulation, that would suggest a path for changing culture within the organization, and then therefore changing people and transforming people. And we're thinking about the paths of this, and I'll just talk about the various experiments that we're in the process of doing in this area. And so you could think about the altruistic capital accumulating through various things. So habit formation is one of them, which is very much from behavioral economics, or learning by doing, which is just this, we are what we repeatedly do. But it could also be, and I've heard this from many people, that they never actually did realize how happy it made them. We know this from psychology too, that people regularly underestimate the happiness it gives them to give to other people. So if you have any uncertainty about your own preferences about that, then actually experimenting on that and finding out is one path to which you could accumulate this altruistic capital. And the same about others. Imagine if you're in an industry where you think everyone else is like that, then you would behave like this, and then you're just in this equilibrium where everyone is behaving very selfishly, not realizing that actually everyone would love to be behaving differently. And then potentially over time, and Aristotle talked about this, Mencius talked about this in Chinese virtue ethics, over time you could become more and more aware of more opportunities and refined opportunities for paths of service to others. And so that could lead to basically altruistic capital moving in this direction over time and throughout society. Of course, it can also deplete. And it could deplete, in particular, one path through which it can deplete is when there's dissonance between what the stated values of an organization or a country are and what is actually happening. That actually can deplete any existing altruistic capital as well and create lower productivity. And so we want to be able to test this within the realm of work, which is where people spend most of their days and where they do most of this repeated action. So if it's true that repeated actions shape your behavior, then for an adult, a lot of your character can be continually formed at work. We know that neuroplasticity continues far beyond adolescence. And so it's not a surprise, actually, that this generation is very much demanding meaning in work and for their work to have social impact. Maybe there's an understanding that this is actually, it's not just their work that's at stake, it's who they are that's at stake. We're thinking about this in particular in the banking industry, where it's often characterized by a dysfunctional culture that fosters dishonesty, and this has been documented, but of course the financial crisis really brought this to the fore for everyone. But banking is something that arguably has one of the greatest effects on social welfare through being able to allocate credit to productive activities. So what we're doing now is collaborating with a globally private bank whose clients are among the wealthiest individuals in the world to really think about what it means to connect to the social impact of this work. And it would be a randomized control trial that allows clients to connect with that. And so what we're doing is designing a workshop that helps the employees to reflect on their own altruistic capital and then take on the perspective of their clients and help them understand how they can develop their altruistic capital, not only in their investments, but potentially in all the other parts of their lives. Of course, that requires an alignment with many other things, including the forms and the incentives that these employees face, and data on the social impact of these investments. But it will allow us to see, what we're hoping to do is actually track all of these employees over many, many years to be able to see changes in their own awareness and other activities, as well as clients, and then ultimately of the investments themselves. But the thing is that altruistic capital is something, I think often when we think about an altruistic activity, we think about it as, I'm going to give to philanthropy or I'm going to volunteer. And now here we're trying to think about, yes, connecting your work to the social impact it can have and thinking about it as service. But actually, we started thinking a lot that, altruistic capital is something that should really be across many domains. Because all of our lives contain so many different aspects. And so we posit, this is a hypothesis that we want to test in the next experiments, that taking altruistic actions in one domain can help you be more altruistic in other parts of your life as well. Again, that's different from a lot of the prevailing discourse in psychology, which suggests that you might actually, by doing altruistic action in one domain, you might feel a moral license to do less altruistic action in another domain. This suggests the opposite. And so you can think about many domains, that in fact it's not just your work, but it's how you treat your family members, it's how you treat your coworkers, it's what you do in your community, it's the investments you make, the personal relationships, et cetera. And all of those feed into your building of altruistic capital and can spill over. And so this is a way in which, you invest in green energy, let's say you start volunteering, that altruistic capital starts to grow, support local businesses, you teach your coworkers, that altruistic capital starts to grow. But then you stop volunteering, you neglect your personal relationships, the altruistic capital starts to deplete. There's like an atrophy of a muscle. And it's taking into account that the actions today will affect the cost of the actions tomorrow. And so we're looking at this spillovers of domains in the realm of conscious consumption, which is something that I think a lot of companies are thinking about, a lot of consumers are thinking about, and the idea is that while a lot of what we think about as sustainable consumption or conscious consumption is kind of a fad or a trend, is there a way to design it so that it actually starts to spill over into other realms? And so that's what we're in discussions with to look at. I realize I have 5 minutes, so I'm just going to go to the next one. And basically, we're going to think about offering people opportunities after they've done some kind of conscious consumption, what we call conscious consumption, in the grocery realm, and then think about to what extent it spills over. And again, one dimension of this is creating a sense of identity that you want to be consistent with. Okay, so and then the final one is really just this paying more attention to the various opportunities to serve. So this last experiment is something that actually I'm personally motivated by, and so let me finish with this and then talk about my kind of personal stake in all of this. What we were really interested in is just this dynamic that I think exists all over the world, and that we're quite everyone's sort of in the discourse on future work thinking about, which is that there is a strong trend of unemployment, particularly among men of a certain age, that comes often through automation, for example, the closing of factories and mining. There's something that's a very big deal in the UK. And it's particularly challenging for the older cohort, because what happens is they might have extensive experience in the field. They lose their job in the industry that they've been in for their whole lives, and they can't find another job in that industry. They lose not only their sense of their income, but really their sense of identity. And so even when the income is covered, the sense of meaning and identity is not. And the idea here is that potentially, if we can open people to the idea of thinking about where they can asking the question of how they can best contribute their skills and talents to society, they might be able to open up to a whole realm of jobs that they may not have thought about previously. It basically creates a weight on another aspect of the job, rather than just status or income, but rather how much will this job help me to serve society? And this is particularly important when you think about, like, at the same time that there is this closing of factories and mines, there's a great shortage in the service sector, in particular in the health sector, in the UK, for example, and also in Canada. But there are these cultural and psychological barriers of moving people into that. And so we're collaborating to create a volunteering program that is involved with an orienting and debriefing workshop that helps people think about how they want to best make their contribution to society. And that is very motivated by a quote that's very much motivated me in my life, that work done in the spirit of service is the highest form of worship, which is a quote from the Baha'i writings. And what's interesting to me about that is that this is about all kinds of work. This is about connecting all of our work, any work that you're doing, as service, and that is like akin to worship. It's a devotional activity. And so actually I wanted to say that it's very moving for me to be here, and especially to have heard Lillian's introduction, because I came to Canada as a scared little girl with my family, escaping religious persecution, and feeling quite alienated. Didn't know the language, the culture was so different, and coming to a country that had a discourse about creating a sense of belonging. It gave me a way to think about how I could contribute. And I think that question, how can I serve? How can I contribute? Where can I make my greatest contribution? That created that connection. It overcame that sense of alienation. It gave the belonging. And I guess that's kind of what I would want to leave you with, is the idea that by asking ourselves that question, we can design environments, we can design our work environments, we can design incentives and products and everything else that determines how we live, so that we not only affect the choices we make today, but we affect the kind of people we become. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Nava, for this excellent and very exciting lecture. Now we are going to open our Q&A session. So I will be taking questions. I can see our mic runners. Can you? Okay, sounds good. All right, so I'm going to keep it to one question per person, if possible. If there's more time, we can continue with the discussion, just for the sake of having give people opportunity to take their turns. Okay? Over there. Can you raise your hand?
Thank you very much. Really interesting. I'm sure you've heard this lots of times. The McDonald's Employee of the Month thing, where the big corporation doesn't pay its workers, but gives this fake kind of recognition. And we're all really cynical of that. So what's your response to that?
Yeah, great. Yeah. Great question. Actually, the experiment that I didn't show you because of time is, in fact, what's really important with the hairdressers is that those stars this is not their full-time job. This was like an extra thing for them. When we talked with the Ministry of Health had heard about these results in Zambia and asked us to design these stars and social incentives for a full-time health worker job. And we basically said, you know, we don't think it would be useful as a full-time recognition or as a substitute. And so, in fact, we did an experiment where we randomized whether people were recruited using just help serve your community or some kind of social recognition versus, you know, career incentives to actually help them flourish on their own. And what we found, and so this was for health workers that were providing health services in remote rural communities. And what we found is that those who were recruited with career incentives actually did 30% more household visits and had significantly larger impacts on the health of their communities than those who were recruited with just help serve your community. So I think it's very crucial when we think about something that is like a full-time job, that we're not kind of pretending to placate people with these non-financial incentives.
Okay, thank you. Next question, over there.
Yeah, good evening, Dr. Ashraf. Thank you very much for your work and your contributions. Can you, if we take your findings and the findings of your colleagues at Thaler, if we take them one level up to the macro level, where do you see contributions of behavioral science there? You can see that in DSGE models we're adding frictions after frictions, but there isn't really a breakthrough. I feel like do you think there is a role that behavioral science can play also in macroeconomics?
I think there's actually a very, there's a group, like a network now on behavioral economics and macroeconomics. I think there's a lot there. I would say I don't want to talk about an area I don't know anything about, so, or less about than I know in my area.
Okay, thank you. There was a question over there. I think first I can see the row you over there. Can you raise your hand, or is it? Yeah. Do you?
Thank you, Dr. Ashraf, for your presentation. I really enjoyed every part of that. My question refers back to almost the first part of your presentation about the impacts of traumas on people, how it weakens their ability to sort of envision about their future. My question is, how do you see, or is there any sort of specific study about the societal level or the collective level that impacts of major events like wars or revolution have on societies or communities that sort of hinders their ability to envision a better future for the society writ large? Thank you.
I think there's an extensive literature on that. Again, not in economics, but in other fields. It is interesting how, just like there's post-traumatic stress disorder, and there's also post-traumatic growth. So individuals vary tremendously in whether they're able to actually grow from the traumatic experience or experience worse outcomes. I think the same is true for countries. So it's very interesting working in Colombia or speaking to the government in Rwanda, where I think in part the trauma actually, now that it's been resolved, but that's the thing, I think there needs to be some reconciliation process that comes to terms with the trauma collectively. Because otherwise there's no truth in it. But I think, but when there is that, there's a kind of hyper-awareness of the vulnerability that we face and the interdependence that we have. And that awareness, I think, causes you to be even more vigilant in contributing to each other and making sure no one's falling behind. That's at least the experience I've seen. So I think countries probably have a similar pattern as individuals.
Thank you. Fernando was next over there.
All right, thank you. So my question relates to both the altruistic capital and this idea of the capacity to imagine the future that you stress. And it's related to the intergenerational transmission of these things, because there is a way that we socialize and we learn about this capital and capacity to imagine, and whether there's any evidence or any thoughts on that.
Yeah, so the Becker and Mulligan paper that I mentioned initially exactly talks about that, is sort of how families transmit this capacity to imagine the future. And that actually then becomes yet another factor that creates this wedge between families that are doing well and families that are not.
Thank you. There is, I think, over there, yes. Can you bring the mic? Thank you.
Well, thank you very much for such a motivational lecture, even though it was about economics. But as I was listening, I thought it would be boring because I come from a social science perspective. And I was listening, I was constantly thinking about two persons, Anthony Giddens and Amartya Sen. So Amartya Sen talks about enhancing the capabilities and the human agency, and Giddens talks about the structuration. So I wonder, by any chance, have you thought about how your concept of altruistic capital, which I consider is the accumulation of good work, kind of karma, relates to these two concepts of the social science?
So what was the first one? So I'm familiar with Amartya Sen and
Anthony
capabilities.
Giddens' structuration, Anthony Giddens from the London School of Economics. He talks about structuration, that the individuals, they interact, and as they interact, they draw upon the rules and the resources. So if we, for example, manipulate the rules and the resources or change them, those would then change the human behavior as well.
Yeah.
So I wonder whether, your concept relates to these two
Yeah, I think it does. I think it does on both dimensions. I think the Gibbons one is much more about the system-wide things. And I think actually there's increasing incorporation within economics of how institutions can create certain kinds of citizens, for example. So Besley and Person have a paper on that. The capabilities work is very much motivated my work, and Amartya Sen obviously has very much motivated me. I think what's interesting actually is this is certainly a capability. I don't know if I would call it karma. But it is a capability that provides a form of empowerment that we might not usually think about. So we usually think about empowerment as something that is sort of independent of others in some way, creating agency, creating a voice. This is a kind of empowerment that comes from figuring out how you can contribute to others. And that creates a sense of agency. It creates a way out of helplessness.
Thank you. Yeah, that's it. Next question.
In your talk, you explained the concept of the finding and the mechanism of altruistic capital. But in North America, our economy system is operate on the shareholder value, which maximize profit. So for the last 4 decades, government keep giving out financial rewards such as tax cut or non-financial rewards such as recognition to corporations that can so that they can create jobs. But reality is that has not happened. Corporations, they instead of investing and creating jobs, they just they buy back stock. They put the money back into buy back stock. So I'm wondering, your altruistic capital, the experiment in Zambia, are there any way that can be applied to corporations that help them to nudge them in a positive way?
Yeah, so actually almost all of the new experiments are all with corporations, with large corporations. One is with a major global bank, and the other one I haven't talked about is a major global consumer goods company. And it's really about taking corporations who claim to want to have a social purpose and saying, what does it mean to actually live that fully? Because a couple things I want to say about what you're mentioning. First of all, altruistic capital isn't, one form of it could be financial capital used for altruistic purposes, but it's much more than that, right? It's about the capacity within individuals. Of course, it can aggregate within an organization. I think crucially, when you mention maximizing shareholder value, that doesn't necessarily mean maximizing profits. I think we often think that that's what it means, but it depends on what the shareholders want. So if what shareholder value is social impact, then the fiduciary duty of that company is to maximize social impact, because that's what the shareholders have asked for. So in fact, there is a way of transforming companies depending on who the investors are and what their preferences are. I think there is a significant transformation going on in companies through 3 channels that use the market to actually create this kind of transformation. One is the shareholders. The other is consumers who demand and are willing to pay for things that have greater social impact. And the last is employees. I think that is actually probably going to be the biggest one, is as more and more people are demanding work with meaning and social impact, companies will not be able to get away with. So what's happening now is that they've already seen that. So what they do is create missions that have purpose. But then, like we talked about, you could have, that could be even worse if the rest of your company is dissonant with that. So very soon, I think many companies, in order to recruit and retain talent, are already starting to and will need to think much more about how they can truly create social impact.
Thank you. Okay, let's go to the other side now. Who was first? Maybe you? Okay. And then after her, it's you, in the red shirt.
Thank you for the very informative and very touching presentation. So I could not help but think how your research and your field of work might help us to really reorient and in terms of how we approach democracy, especially in the age of polarization, in terms of how we can reorient to the future and reorient to others to make long-term choices in terms of our political choices, in terms of our voting choices, or in terms of kind of really diversify that political spectrum. So I just want to get your take on that, and if there's any relevant research on behavioral economics and democracy.
Yeah, there's a lot of really good research on polarization, on biased beliefs, on the fact that there's, for example, in behavioral economics, we know very strongly that there's we all have this confirmation bias that, again, comes from our desire for consistency, right? So we want to hear things that are consistent with our prior beliefs. It makes us feel better, and we don't feel dissonant. Companies realize this, news agencies realize this, so they provide things that are consonant with that. The more we have that, the more we want it, and then we can just polarize through that. So actually what that requires is us going against our hardwiring and looking for disconfirming evidence, really searching for things that are maybe different from what we think. And that's hard. I think it actually, again, it goes against kind of what's hardwired in our system. And the incentives in the market are to provide what people want, which again is this consonant, this confirmatory evidence. So I don't know what it would take to shift that, because the way these models go, you're just never going to end. It's just constant polarization. I do think that, not to be too simplistic about it, but again, I can't help but think that, if you're really asking yourself the question, but truly asking yourself the question, how can I contribute to society? How can I make my contribution? The dialogue you have with people who are different from you just changes. You're not as focused on persuading someone about your opinion or trying to get them to change something about themselves. You're just trying to figure out how to help together. I wonder if that, it's a kind of way of sidestepping in a way. But there's much better people than me to answer that question, I think.
Thank you. You were first.
Hi. Sorry. Hi. Early on in your presentation, you talked about how altruistic capital is related to how governments or societies describe themselves, and if there's a dissonance between how they describe themselves and their actions and what their actions actually are, there's a negative impact on altruistic capital. In a lot of places in the world, there's a lot of irresponsible governance that has caused a lot of distrust that has potentially harmed this idea of altruistic capital. Do you believe that there's a way to rehabilitate the sense of goodwill and altruistic capital even in places where there is this large distrust?
Yeah, it's a hard question. It's a very good question, because I think it's very important to ask that question, because recognizing that any given action has so many externalities on the future is very important. I guess, if we think about altruistic capital like a muscle, it can atrophy, but maybe it can be built up again, slowly. I think what we know from trust in the literature is that it has to be built. If it gets destroyed, it's quite difficult to rebuild, and it needs to get rebuilt very slowly and little by little, with just little actions that keep reinforcing. And I guess I would say that that's the way you would do that. But both as you think about governments and what governments can do to decrease trust with people, and companies. And so we're often putting ourselves in cultures and environments where it's going to deplete the goodwill we have and the kind of whatever we've built up. And it's really important, I think, to the extent that we have a choice of where we can go to do that, and to the extent that we don't have a choice, that the people who are designing those environments recognize the externalities they're having.
Okay, thank you. There is a question over there. In the first row, yeah.
Thank you. Yes, and thank you. My background is in mental health and addictions, so I'm really curious about if you've taken a look at some of the parallels in your study with the female condoms and what that is and the incentive with the hairdressers. Was that a public kind of star system, or was that more internal for them to see the stars on their own or in comparison with others? But also connecting that to, I see that as something where you want to help somebody in preventing something that could be tragic that happens to them. But me working with a lot of our Indigenous people, there's a lot of criticism in trying to help people with the opioid crisis, trying to help people with homelessness, or other things that they say maybe more in that person's control, even though they don't see it as it is because it's from trauma. So I wanted to know if some people's altruistic kind of giving, is that for things that are more out of control, like environment when there's crisis and things like that, as opposed to what people's preconceived notions are about these other types of trauma that happen?
Yeah, I mean, that's such a great question. I think that's to some extent, I think what's been good about this evidence from behavioral economics and from psychology is that we recognize how many things are not in people's control, really, that are, and this idea that, I think because, for example, when behavioral economics was first sort of starting, it was like some of the implications are, for example, you give people some, so people are notoriously bad at applying for financial aid and going through the forms, for example, really low-income families. So an intervention that helped a lot was having someone come to your home and help you fill out the form. Now, from the outside, that looks like, why do you need to do that? That seems really ridiculous. Why can't that person just fill out the form? But actually understanding the science behind why that's so hard, and then having compassion and recognizing how much of an impact you can make with something that is essentially just accompanying that person, is far more impactful on social welfare. So if what we care about is actually making an impact, there's no doubt that the evidence is all towards compassionate accompaniment in anything that looks even small, and that everything we're learning about the way in which people's past affects their present leads us to think many things are not necessarily in people's control, and we need all the help. We all need all the help we can get. And so I think as we start to build that evidence, I think it becomes clearer and clearer. About your first question, so that's very interesting because actually so some of the hairdressers and barbers had the thermometer up, and some of them just had it in their drawer, and they would like take it out and look at it and feel good and then put it back. So for some of them, I think they were putting it up, and the barbers for sure, they would like kind of go back and forth and compare. But for a lot of people, it was just that kind of personal connection that they felt with what they were doing.
So I see that as kind of a contrast with people who say, oh, but my taxes are going to this and I don't want it to. I suppose people who are openly donating their time and their money to supporting people and making good life changes, right? So I kind of feel like that might be like that empowerment thing you were talking about.
Yeah. Yeah, that's, I mean, I think is what you're saying, that like that personal involvement and connection with what you're doing, the sort of the will to do something, the agency that you take to take the altruistic action is really important. Yeah, I think it's so, there's lots of ways in which it might be very efficient for society to, for example, have all the taxes decide where good can be done, and even like to make sure that there's some pot of philanthropy and it all goes to one area, for example. But I think that might deprive us of the difficult choices of where to put our time and where to put our money, and those choices are partly what make us grow. And if we think that there's this kind of virtue that requires constant choice and constant action to grow, then we don't want to, we want to give ourselves that opportunity.
Thank you. There's time for, I think, one more question, or if we are quick too, Anke first.
We can take a few questions maybe at the same time, and then
Okay,
I'll
sure.
answer them all.
Oh, okay. Okay.
Why don't we take a few, and then I'll
Yes.
answer them.
I love how you ended the talk with the question, how can we serve? I learned in school in economics that the resources are limited, and if for me to have more, then you need to have less, and the other way around. And I truly believe so.
Is that what you learned in economics?
Yes, that's what I learned in school. And I do. So one of my favorite quotes is. If a high tide raises all boats, which means that we can both be successful and win at the same time. So I believe it's so important to shift our mindset from what's in it for me to what's in it for us. But my question is about human needs. So there are several models of human needs. One very well-known one is the Maslow pyramid, where in order for me to think about altruism and contribution, I really need to have my basic needs satisfied, and then I'll be able to give to others, to give beyond myself. Whereas there's another model of the human need psychology. There's 6 human needs. One of them is love and connection, one of them is growth, and one of them is contribution. And that model says that we have all these 6 human needs within us. Contribution is one of them. They are dynamic depending on where we are. So, and then it also says that when we shift our focus from ourselves to contributing beyond ourselves, then all the other needs seem satisfied. So I wanted to ask you, based on your research, what do you think about this?
Good. Should we take a few of them, and then I'll answer in a second?
Yeah.
So when you talked about the different kinds of people within that spectrum, whether they be kind of selfish or altruistic tendencies, I'm wondering if there's any kind of markers or ways that you could establish these differences. I'm wondering specifically if there's a difference between smaller communities where you can kind of see the outcomes of your impact versus larger metropolitan areas that don't really focus on the community and therefore people don't care about their actions. Or conversely, because they can't see their impact, they're looking for a meaning. So I'm wondering if the size of communities has any impact on the ways that people maybe engage altruistically or don't, based on geography, I guess.
Right. Okay. Any other questions for now? We really have not much time left here. So are they related to those two that are already were asked? No, it's up to you.
It's fine. Yeah, I can answer quickly.
Sure.
Okay. Sure.
Go ahead.
It's not close anyway. If altruistic capital is somewhat similar to the physical capital, then the behavior of the investing should have something to do with foresight, right? So then we should see some similarity between regular savings behavior of people and their altruistic behavior. So it's like a test of implication. Do we see that, or? I'm not much familiar with the literature, so do we see such a relation or not?
Okay.
Yeah, what I told was that if altruistic capital is somewhat related with the physical capital, it should have something to do with foresight, the investment behavior in that. So then we should see some similarities between the investment in physical capital and altruistic capital. So do we see it?
Maybe you should
I'll
address the question.
So on Maslow's hierarchy, I get this all the time, and I don't agree. I think that in fact it is more like the human needs psychology. What's really interesting is, like, in the Columbia experiment, we have a lot of people who are very low income and unemployed, and they also say at the beginning, we talk about, thinking about where you want to meet your skills and your passions meet the needs of society, and they say, but we just want to survive. Like, I just want to make money. And then they realize that actually, by having that orientation towards contribution, that is actually the best way they can find their most innovative entrepreneurial activity that will actually allow them to meet the other needs as well. So I think that focusing on Maslow's hierarchy deprives a large majority of people of what we all want is to how to find contribution and meaning, without discounting how important the survival is as well. Smaller communities. This is really, really important. This is a very big discourse in the UK. It might also be in Canada about, what they call somewheres and anywheres, like the people who are rooted in their small communities versus people who are sort of metropolitan, cosmopolitan, and who's more selfish versus not. So I think exactly as you pointed out, it could go in both directions. I think when we are in small communities, there are many opportunities in front of us to serve. At the same time, I think that large, and this is the case, in Africa, the urbanization has been so rapid and so strong that in fact, there's a lot of low trust precisely because people have to constantly be interacting with strangers, but that does provide an opportunity for great growth and not only gains from trade, but also opportunities to serve. So I guess I would say that I think it's easier to do in a small community, but we all, no matter what kind of size of community we're in, crave some form of community and belonging. If we can create that in an environment where we also have the benefits of all of the extraordinary exchange of ideas that come from these large densities, then that's, as my parents would like to say, nur al nur, light upon light. So finally, I think it's just to look at the correlation between financial capital and altruistic capital. There's so many other things involved, plus we don't even really know how to measure fully altruistic capital. So I would say that I don't think we would probably see it in the cross-section. However, there's one thing that makes me think that there is some correlation, which is that it's a similar part of our brain that thinks about the future than thinks about others. So it is, that part of the kind of, it's me, and now, that we have to overcome to think about the future and to think about others. So arguably, it's a similar mechanism. And I think thinking about the interaction between these would be very interesting.
Thank you very much once again, Emma. And thanks everybody else for... Thanks everybody for attending tonight's event. Again, Nava, thank you so much for an extremely exciting and interesting talk and discussion, and we are giving you a gift. Again, many thanks to also the staff from the Public Square, SFU Public Square, as well as Department of Economics, without whose help this would not have been possible. Many thanks to everybody. Have a good evening, and you're all welcome to the reception that's outside in advance. Thank you.